Welcome back to Silk Warrant. Today, in this story, is about the day I stopped being fam until I became useful again.
The folder was still there. 11 years, 2 apartments, 1 cross-country move, and that manila envelope sat in its lockbox like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. My mother used to say she could smell a bad decision before it was made. Funny. She was standing in my kitchen, holding a cup of coffee I'd poured for her, and she had no idea the decision had already been made 3 years earlier by her own attorney. There's a particular silence that happens when someone who cast you out realizes they need you back. It doesn't sound like humility. It sounds like calculation dressed in a softer tone of voice. I'd heard that tone before. I knew exactly what it meant. Let me take you back to where this actually starts. Not the phone call, not the kitchen, not the day my mother said the words that ended 11 years of trying. Further back. I was 24 when I set up the financial structure for Merit Home Services. My parents had been running the business out of a shoebox, no payroll system, no quarterly filings, nothing. I was fresh out of my accounting certification, and I spent 8 weekends reorganizing their books, setting up their tax structure, filing the backlog, and making sure the business wouldn't collapse under its first real audit. My father said, "This is what family does." At the time, I think he meant it as a compliment. I filed the paperwork as co-signatory on the founder's trust because the attorney said someone had to be, and neither of my parents understood what that meant. My brother Danny was 21 and finishing his business degree, which mostly involved a lot of group projects and a semester in Cancun. So it was me. I put the paperwork in a manila folder, labeled it in my handwriting, Founders Trust, CLAIREMERRITT, co-signatory, and put it in my lockbox. Just habit. I save everything. Always have. Nobody mentioned the folder again for 11 years. My brother came home from college with a business degree, a girlfriend named Tara, and a very firm set of opinions about how Merit Home Services should be run. He wanted to rebrand. New vans, new logo, expansion into 3 new counties. My parents thought this was brilliant. He also thought I was being obstructive when I pointed out that the company's cash flow didn't support the expansion timeline, that we'd need a bridge loan, and that the interest alone would eat the first year of projected revenue. My mother had this red pen she kept in her apron pocket. She'd use it to write grocery lists, phone numbers, the occasional note. But whenever she disagreed with something I said, she'd pick it up and click it, once, twice, 3 times, the way some people clear their throat before they say something unkind. She clicked it 3 times and said, "Claire, you've always been a little too cautious." That was the word they started using, cautious, like it was a character flaw. Danny's expansion plan launched the following spring. I was not invited to the meeting where they finalized it. What happened over the next 2 years, I'll tell you plainly. The 3-county expansion went sideways by month 7. 2 of the new territories were underperforming. The bridge loan came due. They had to pull money from equipment reserves to cover it, which meant 3 of their work vans needed repairs they couldn't afford. I know this because my aunt, my mother's sister, Renata, still called me every couple of weeks. She wasn't supposed to, I think. But Renata has never been good at following rules she considers unfair. She'd call and say, "I'm not telling you anything, I'm just wondering how you're doing," and then she'd describe in vivid detail whatever was happening with the family. I listened. I said very little. I did not offer solutions, and for me, that was new. The day my mother told me I wasn't family anymore started with a birthday dinner. My nephew Marcus, Danny's son, turned 7. I showed up with a gift, a card, and a crock-pot full of the macaroni Marcus had specifically requested I make because it was, in his words, the best one. Danny's wife Tara met me at the door. She had the look of someone who had been briefed. She said, "I don't think tonight's a good night, Claire." I asked what she meant. She said the family had been talking, and they felt I had been undermining Danny's confidence and creating a negative energy around the business decisions. She used the phrase toxic dynamic twice and the phrase moving forward once. My mother appeared behind her. She was wearing the necklace, small gold chain, tiny pendant, and her hand went to it immediately. She straightened it. She said, "Claire, I love you. But you've made it very clear you don't support this family. I want you to sit with the logic of that sentence. I set up their business structure. I reorganized 11 years of chaotic bookkeeping. I warned them about a financial decision that later cost them $40,000. And somehow that became, you don't support this family." My father was behind her. He didn't say anything. He looked at the floor. I left the crockpot of macaroni on the porch, got in my car, and drove home. I did not cry until I reached the on-ramp. And then I gave myself exactly 11 minutes, the length of one podcast episode I'd been saving, and after that I was done. 3 years passed. I moved across the country. I built a client list. I made a name for myself doing exactly what I'd done for free for my family, cleaning up financial structures that other people had let fall apart. Renata called. I picked up. She told me Danny had brought in an outside investor who wanted to take a 40% stake in Merit Home Services. The investor, a development group based in Atlanta, was ready to move forward with a deal that would have valued the business at $1.2 million. Except there was a problem. The attorney had discovered something in the original founder's trust documents. There was a co-signatory clause. Any transfer of ownership above 30% required the signature of all named co-signatories on the original trust. Renata's voice was very careful when she said, "Honey, do you know anything about that?" I looked at my bookshelf, third shelf from the bottom where I keep my personal files, the lockbox. I said, "I might have some old paperwork. I'd have to check." There was a silence on the phone that I will remember for a long time. Then Renata said, "Your mother's been trying to find the original documents for 3 weeks. Their attorney says a copy won't work for the investor's legal team. It has to be the original signed set. The original signed set, the one in the manila folder, the one in the lockbox under my bed. The one I'd labeled in my own handwriting 11 years ago out of nothing more than habit." She called on a Tuesday. Not my father, not Danny, my mother. She opened with, "I've been thinking about you a lot lately." I said, "I'm listening." She told me things had been complicated with the business. That there was an opportunity they didn't want to miss. That family was family, and she hoped we could put the past behind us. I noticed that she did not say she was sorry. I noticed that she did not say she had been wrong. I noticed that she straightened her necklace. I couldn't see it, but I knew. Because she said, right in the middle of the sentence, "Hold on just 1 second," and there was a 2-second pause that I recognized. It was the same pause as the hand going to the chain. She asked if I would be willing to come home and speak with their attorney. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for exactly 1 week. I'm going to be honest with you about what happened in that week, because I think it matters. I was angry for about 2 days. Then I was something worse than angry. I was tired. Tired of the version of myself that still wanted them to say the right thing. That still checked my phone after family birthdays, even though I hadn't been invited. That still made macaroni for a nephew I wasn't allowed to see. On day 5, I called my therapist. We talked for an hour. She asked me what outcome I actually wanted. Not the fantasy outcome, not the revenge outcome, the real one. I said I wanted to stop being held hostage by a document I'd signed out of love. She said, "Okay, so what does that look like?" I thought about it, and then I called a lawyer. My lawyer's name is Priya, and she is exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when the people who were supposed to be in your corner decided they weren't anymore. She reviewed the trust documents in 40 minutes and called me back with a voice that was carefully neutral, which meant she was trying not to sound as delighted as she was. She said the co-signatory clause was real, enforceable, and that without my signature, the 40% stake transfer to the Atlanta investor could not proceed. The deal had a 45-day window. 22 of those days were already gone. She asked what I wanted to do, and then I told her exactly what I wanted. I flew home on a Thursday. My parents didn't know I had a lawyer. They thought I was coming to talk. We met at their attorney's office. A man named Gerald who had represented the family for 20 years and who shook my hand a little too firmly, the way people do when they're nervous. My mother was there. She had the necklace on. Her hand was already at her collarbone before she'd even sat down. Danny was there. He looked older. He looked tired in the way that people look tired when a decision they were certain about has been quietly dismantling itself. Gerald explained the situation for the room, as though I hadn't already had it explained to me in detail by someone sharper. Then he looked at me and said, "Claire, we're hoping you'll be willing to sign off on this transfer as co-signatory." I said, "I'm prepared to discuss it." Danny shifted in his seat. My mother's hand moved to the necklace. Gerald said, "Of course, is there something you'd like to address first?" I put my folder on the table. Not the manila one, a new one, printed clean. My lawyer had helped me prepare it. I said, 3 years ago I was told I wasn't family, that I created a negative energy, that I didn't support this family. Those weren't anonymous opinions. They were communicated clearly. And they resulted in me being excluded from my nephew's 7th birthday while the crockpot I brought sat on the porch. My mother opened her mouth. I kept going. "I'm not here to relitigate that. I'm here because I was a co-signatory on this trust, before Danny graduated college, before the expansion plan. Before any of this, and that document doesn't change based on how the family feels about me in a given year." Silence. Danny said, "Claire," I said, "let me finish." And for once he actually did. I looked at Gerald. I said, "I will sign the transfer documents. I have one condition." Gerald had his pen ready. A formal, written acknowledgement, not a text message, not a phone call, that I have fulfilled my legal and financial obligations to this business, and that my co-signatory status be formally dissolved upon completion of this transaction. My mother said, "Claire, that's not necessary. You're still family." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "You were right that I've always been cautious, Mom. You were wrong about everything else." She straightened her necklace. Her hand was shaking. Gerald prepared the acknowledgement. It took 40 minutes. The language was clear, legal, and final. I signed the transfer documents. I signed the dissolution of my co-signatory status. I put the manila folder, the original one, 11 years old, with my handwriting on the label, on Gerald's desk. I didn't need it anymore. A few minutes later, the meeting was over. My father walked me to the elevator. It was the first time we'd been alone since the birthday dinner. He looked at the floor the way he had that night. Then he looked up and said, "I should have said something back then." I said, "Yes, you should have." The elevator opened. I got in. Renata took me to dinner that night. A small Italian place she'd been going to for 30 years, where the bread comes out warm and the owner knows her name. She didn't ask me how I felt. She just poured the wine and said, "You've always been the one who held things together." "You know that, right?" I said, "I know." She said, "What do you do now that you don't have to anymore?" I thought about that. The bread was warm, the wine was good. The restaurant smelled like garlic and old wood, and something I didn't have a name for. I said, "I'm going to find out." I spent 11 years being the person who kept things from falling apart. I saved every document, answered every call, drove home for every holiday even when the welcome was conditional. And when they needed something I had, something they'd forgotten I even held, the door opened again. Not because I was family, because I was useful. There's a version of this story where I refuse to sign, where I let the deal collapse, where I make them feel what I felt standing on that porch. That's not the story I chose. Because I didn't want to spend another 3 years being defined by what they did. I signed. I walked out. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't look back to see if anyone was watching. I didn't burn the bridge. I just finally stopped pretending I was the one holding it up. Before you close this out, I want to ask you something real. If the people closest to you had to describe who you are today, would their version match who you actually are? Or have you been so busy holding things together for everyone else that the answer to that question is something you've never had the quiet to find out?